There's a couple of things that I want to go over under migration and settlement, America and the world, and then I want to end with this piece about the First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment and their importance to what's going to happen next. Um, there are two different groups of people that come into the American colonies during period two. Religious dissidents come into the North, right? Um, we typically think of them as Puritans, right? Or as pilgrims or separatists, you know. But whenever we say religious dissidents, we're also talking about groups like the Quakers who come into Pennsylvania, just as an example. There are Lutherans who are fleeing from parts of Central Europe, such as Germany and Scandinavia, that come into Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey. And so I think Katie needs, somebody needs to let Katie in. So whenever we think of this period, one of the interesting things that I take away from this whenever I think of the word religious dissident is that people who are people who are being persecuted because of their religious beliefs are coming throughout period two into the American colonies. It's not something that's a phenomena that's just related to the Puritans themselves. There are other groups, the Quakers being the best example, but also Catholics as well, who come to Maryland, for example, and parts of Northern Virginia. So I want us to place it in proper perspective that when we talk about the Puritans, they're not the only group. They're among the groups of religious dissidents that are making their way from Europe into the colonies during this period. Also, think of the difference in the people that largely come to the southern colonies during this period. Well, I say investors because a lot of the people that originally came who were of some means, who were fairly well off, these were people who had invested in joint stock companies which financed the early colonies. Particularly whenever we think of this, we're thinking of Jamestown as our example with the with the first joint stock companies creating colonies in essence from the beginning, from the ground up. And the idea of a joint stock company was that you would pool your wealth, you would pool your resources, and you wouldn't lose as much money if the colony was not productive in some sense. But we also have to think about it in this sense. All of the joint stock company ventures fail. The religious dissident colonies actually are those that we think of as being highly successful in New England and in the North. And the middle colonies, while they had been controlled by the Dutch up until 1664, we largely forget that they're highly successful and quite diverse in their leaning as well from a cultural standpoint. That was something that we talked about yesterday whenever we stepped into the idea of culture. Related to what's below that, this racial caste system developing in the South, right? Lesser nobles. Remember, feudalism is not quite what we would think of in terms of it being abolished yet in England during this period. So we have a lot of what we would call lesser nobles. Families were large, even noble families were large. And it was often just the eldest sons, for example, that would inherit large sums of property or large amounts of property that had high values attached to them. So lesser nobles, younger sons in other words, might move to the New World. And if they did, they stood the opportunity of acquiring land grants of some means. In large part, these are the people that have the ability to create the plantation system that we see developing in the American South or in the southern colonies. One of the things to think about is simply this. So you have a caste system that develops. You have lesser nobles. We will call them aristocrats during this period in the American colonies, who are largely slave owners, who own large sums of land. Most often they're probably tobacco planters if they're living in Virginia and Maryland. They might engage in rice farming or the growth of indigo or hemp or another crop, maybe sugar, for example, in South Carolina. These are people, and we have to understand this, who, while they would not have been of substantial means in Europe, were of substantial means in the southern colonies. Below them are, and they're a clear step below them, are people who are shopkeepers, merchants who live in the bustling port cities of the South. There aren't many of those. Charleston in South Carolina and Savannah in Georgia, for example, are among the two of those that we think of in the South. So in other words, this merchant class in the South is very small in number at best, right? Below them are what are called yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers are people who have a land grant. They own their own land. They form their own communities in the colonial backcountry. They're self-sufficient, and in some cases they're selling their market goods to people within their community or people in the neighboring communities. Below them you have indentured servants, largely white, largely European, largely Western European in terms of their cultural or ethnic orientation. And then below them, of course, you have an overwhelming, by the beginning of the 18th century, you begin the process of having an overwhelming number of slaves at the bottom of this caste system, right? It's, for us, right, it's no coincidence that the slave codes that are written in the Caribbean in the 1650s and 1660s, that are written in response to the first slave rebellions in places like Jamaica and Barbados, for example, that those slave codes become inherited and written in places like Virginia, as we saw in our class, by the mid and late 1660s. So what we think of as slavery, and this is, again, we went over Bacon's rebellion, so we saw this transition from indentured servitude and slavery. We saw this yesterday. But what I want us to think about is this. This is the beginning of that system of slave importation. By the beginning of the 18th century, we're beginning the process of seeing indentured servants being outnumbered by slaves for the first time. It's also no coincidence that we start seeing the first slave rebellions here in the American colonies for the first time in 1712. By 1739, 1741, in South Carolina with the Stono Rebellion and the Great Rebellion in New York City, we see the first two major slave rebellions that actually break out here in the American colonies. Now, if there is a sense of asking the question about it, right, a question about where does abolitionism begin, we have to step back for a moment and remember something. Yes, slavery is geographically based. That's in large part because of what we talked about yesterday. As one went northward, it became harder to grow the cash crops that slave labor were used to grow, right? But that's only one sense of the question, right? As we go northward, and we look at the Quakers in particular, but the Puritans as well, we begin to see societies developing in places like Pennsylvania and New England that are at odds with the idea of slavery from the beginning. In fact, what we think of as the birth of abolitionism really begins at the dawn of the 18th century, after the Salem witchcraft trials, when we see Puritan ministers who are beginning to speak out about this growing practice themselves. Why would they do that? If you saw slaves in the North, you didn't see them in agriculture. You saw them in the port cities, most likely, right? Is there this sense of slavery stunning the economy? We have to wait for the first half of the 19th century for that question to be answered in that way. This is an ethical question. This becomes a moral question for the Puritans and the Quakers. For them, this is a question about human dignity, right? And so it's really, for us, really interesting that they are the first people that really target slavery. But it should not be a stranger to us from the idea in the way in which they target it as a moral and ethical issue, because it's going to not be strange to us that the abolitionist movement also has its roots here, right? Whenever I say it has its roots here, I'm referring to the 1820s and 1830s. I'm not referring to the early 18th century, right? But it's a continuity in American life that the opposition to slavery has a New England tinge to it from the very beginning, right? Whereas in the South, we had a recreation of the feudal system as it existed in England. The only difference between those two systems was the large number of African slaves by the mid-18th century that had been imported into that system. So I think for us, that's really important to understand. The other thing that I think is important to understand for us as well is that slavery slowly makes its way into the backcountry of places like the Carolinas, Virginia, and Maryland. Ultimately, in the beginning of the process, let's say first half of the 18th century, slavery is more of a coastal phenomenon for a couple of different reasons, right? I hate to say this on camera, but one of the questions on our test, on our mock test, that we by and large missed had to do with a map of colonial America from 1700 to 1775. One of the things that that map clearly showed was one of the things, in fact, it was probably the most frequently missed question on the test, was that it showed that the reasons for colonial settlement and the number and who settled where actually came down to two major factors. The first was the wealth of the people who settled in an area. And the second was the time of their arrival, who they were, where they came from, and when they came to the American colonies. And the answer to that question is kind of the direction I'm going in now. The answer is actually this. Colonial economic development, particularly in the southern colonies, was based on the coastal areas. Why? Because it was easier to get your cash crops or products to foreign markets, right? Same thing with the New England communities. There are very few New England communities, agricultural communities, that are in the backcountry. Most of the people who are living in the backcountry, right, again, are yeoman farmers, but these are people who are self-sufficient. They're not selling them their products or their goods in this intercolonial or interregional trade network that's attached to the British Empire. But the large-scale plantations by the mid-18th century are selling into that market. And so therefore, because of their status, because of their land holdings, they also tended to do what? They tended to own all the choice coastal land. Well, that forced a lot of small farmers and yeoman farmers to live in the backcountry. Yes, we've already talked about the fact that that caused tensions with the Native Americans, and over time, absolutely that dynamic is going to be there. But the other dynamics that's going to be there is there's this developing sense of identity of living in the backcountry on the one hand as a colonist versus living in the port cities and in the coastal areas in another. Is it this rural-urban divide that we think of by education or that we think of by outlook? Sort of. It's really a rural-urban divide by socioeconomic status as well. And we have to think about it in that sense too. If we look at which groups are more affected by the social trends of the time, the cultural trends of the time, we have to say that the First Great Awakening had much more of an impact on those colonial citizens who were living in the backcountry. Why? Well, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, they were dissidents themselves, usually. People who moved from places like Ireland and Scotland. They moved there because of, number one, they were not wanted by the British government. There's several uprisings, for example, in Scotland, one in 1707, one again in 1745. The English are brutal in suppressing these uprisings, particularly the last one from 1745 to 1748 in Scotland. A number of those people are kicked into what is Northern Ireland today. That's where there's a tension that's ongoing in Ireland that still has a modern element to it. This idea that you're kicking mostly Calvinists, right? Essentially the same people that we refer to as the religious dissidents of New England. You're kicking them into Northern Ireland. But Ireland's predominantly a Catholic colony of the British Empire at this point in time. Now all of a sudden they're not wanted there. And so what are you doing? Well, you're taking these people who are not wanted in Ireland, who were enemies of the state necessarily, right, in Scotland, And now you're shipping them into the backcountry of the American colonies. What's the problem with doing that? Well, in the 1740s and 1750s, virtually nothing for the British Empire. But by the 1760s and the 1770s, whenever tension between the American colonies and the British Empire are brewing, these people who have a deep-seated hatred for all things British are going to become their worst nightmare during the American Revolution. However, we have to think about this for just a moment. They're affected by the First Great Awakening for a couple of different reasons. Number one, life in the colonial backcountry in these small communities centered around their community church. Number two, religion played a very important role in their very lives and always had. This is a history of a group of people from a cultural standpoint. Third, the message of the awakening is critical to understand. The itinerant preachers who do not have a church or established church of their own, who are traveling around the backcountry of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, the backcountry of the Carolinas. What sort of message are they preaching? Well, they're preaching a couple of different messages. First of all, the first message that they're preaching is that no matter what your background had been, you're important in the eyes of God. To people who have been oppressed, who literally have been the redheaded stepchild of the British Crown, that's a pretty powerful and important message to actually hear for the first time. Second, they're preaching that they should be more involved in the creation of their own community governments, in the affairs of their community and in the affairs of their churches. Well, why is this important? Well, it's important for two different reasons. First of all, not only are you making these people feel important for the first time, but you're also making them feel involved in the most important institution in their lives for the first time. The other thing that you're doing is something else. You're challenging the established churches. What are the established churches? Well, obviously the Puritan church in New England is being challenged by the Second Great Awakening, and in some cases, right, it's also being moved in a different direction because of the Second Great Awakening, right? Towards a more independent direction for different congregations. But the other thing that's happening is something else, right? In the southern colonies, the predominant religion was Anglicanism. Most of the people that the itinerant preachers are actually trying to win over, right, as converts are former Calvinists or Presbyterians in some cases, right? So now all of a sudden, what's interesting is you have a challenge to the established churches in the South as well, right? This leads to a sense of identity, a sense of independence for people in the backcountry. And it also leads for them, right, to feel important in protecting the values and the integrity of their communities. If I look at the port cities, it's the Enlightenment that has so much more of an impact on them. These people tend to be urbane, they tend to be well-cultured, they tend to be more well-educated, they tend to have greater connections within the British Empire to the European world. There tend to be more immigrants, not just coming through here, but staying here, that create that sense of urbane culture that's growing in the port cities. And so therefore the ideals of the Enlightenment, the importance of the individual, are going to have much more of an effect on people living in those cities who are well educated and constitute a very small percentage of the population versus the awakening, right? So it's no strange happenstance that when we get into the years leading up to the American Revolution, that what we see is this: a very small group of well-educated men become the founding fathers and heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. But a very large group of people, Americans, who were colonists living in the colonial backcountry, are going to form the backbone of the Continental armies that will eventually win the revolution on the battlefield. Okay? Now, if we look at the dynamics that are occurring by 1750, there's a couple of things that are at work. The French and the British, we're going to call them this after 1707, the French and the British are in competition for the Mississippi River Valley, the heartland of North America. As British settlers begin moving into the West, they're encroaching into lands that are essentially claimed by the French, right? There had been competition between the Dutch and the French for the fur trade. Now that competition is between the British and the French. The Spanish still own much of the American Southwest plus Florida, right? We're talking about the dynamics that will occur in Europe for the 7 Years' War on the one hand, but on our soil here in North America, we're talking about the dynamics that lead to that conflict beginning in the first place, which we refer to as the French and Indian War, which is where we end period 2, okay? I mentioned the Dred Scott case in period 4 leading up to the Civil War, but I didn't spend a lot of time on the importance of the case. Okay, Dred Scott moves with his slave owner into what will be Wisconsin. He'd been born in Missouri, had been a slave in Missouri, excuse me. But when he moves into Wisconsin with his master dies. Dred Scott sues for his freedom because he's living in essence in a territory or state now where slavery doesn't exist. The case reaches the Supreme Court in 1857. And what the case essentially said was this, was that Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was a slave and therefore not a citizen, so he had no standing in a federal court. The problem with the ruling said this too, that no matter where Dred Scott lived, he would still be a slave. So therefore, if you're someone like Abraham Lincoln and people of similar ideology or ideological ilk, right, and you believe in the power of free markets, and you believe in the market economy that's growing and commercial agriculture that are growing into the West, right? Your ideology is in direct opposition to the ideals of having slave labor. You believe that slave labor stunts the economy, and rightly so. The problem with this is that now, because of the Supreme Court ruling in 1857, it's basically saying that there can be no restrictions geographically that are constitutional over the issue of slavery. So therefore, slavery can exist anywhere. And that's the problem with the Dred Scott decision. In other words, the Dred Scott decision basically said that the only way that you were going to get rid of the institution of slavery was by law. You would have to create a constitutional amendment to deal with the issue of the institution of slavery, either stopping its expansion on the one hand or entirely getting rid of it on the other.